Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. In this video, I will teach you All for Love, the play by John Dryden. So without any further delay, let's get into the video. Now let's look at John Dryden. John Dryden, born in Northamptonshire, England on August 9, 1631, came from a landowning family with connections to Parliament and the Church of England. He studied as a King's Scholar at the prestigious Westminster School of London, where he later sent two of his own children. There, Dryden was trained in the art of rhetorical argument, which remained a strong influence on the poet's writing and critical thought throughout his life. Dryden published his first poem in 1649. He was enrolled at Trinity College in Cambridge the following year, where he likely studied the classics, rhetoric and mathematics. Then he obtained his BA degree in 1654 and graduating first in his class. And then in June of that year, Dryden's father died. And after graduation, Dryden found work with Oliver Cromwell's Secretary of State, John Thurlow, marking a radical shift in the poet's political views. Alongside Puritan poets such as John Milton and Andrew Marvell, Dryden was present at Cromwell's funeral in 1658, and 1 year later he published his first important poem, Heroic Stanzas, eulogizing the leader. Then in 1660, Dryden celebrated the regime of King Charles II with Astrea Redux, a royalist panegyric in praise of the new king. And in that poem, Dryden apologized for his allegiance with the Cromwellian government. Though Samuel Johnson excused Dryden for this, writing in his Lives of the Poets, that is in the year 1779, that if he changed with the nation. So he also notes that the earlier work was not totally forgotten and in fact raised him enemies. And despite this, Dryden quickly established himself after the Restoration as the leading poet and literary critic of his day. He published to His Sacred Majesty a panegyric on his coronation in the year 1662 and to my Lord Chancellor in 1662 again, possibly to quote aristocratic patrons. Then that year, Dryden was proposed for membership in the Royal Society and was elected an early fellow. Then in 1663, he married Lady Elizabeth, the royalist sister of Sir Robert Howard. Then, following the death of William Davenant in April 1668, Dryden became the first official poet laureate of England, and he was conferred by a letters patent from the king. The royal office carried the responsibility of composing occasional works in celebration of public events. Then Dryden, having exhibited that particular dexterity with his earlier panegyrics, was a natural choice. And though the position was most often held for life, that is until 1999, Dryden was the lone exception. He was dismissed by William III and married to in 1668 after he refused to swear an oath of allegiance, remaining loyal to James II. So as a playwright, Dryden published The Wild Gallant in 1663, and though it was not financially successful, he was commissioned to produce 3 plays for the King's Company, and in which he later became a shareholder. So basically his best known dramatic works are Marriage à la Mode in 1672 and All for Love in the year 1678, which was written in blank verse. So when the bubonic plague swept through London in 1665, Dryden moved to Wiltshire, where he wrote Of Dramatic Poesy in the year 1668, the longest of his critical works. The piece takes the form of a dialogue among characters debating and defending international dramatic works and practices. Then in the year 1678, Dryden wrote Macflagney, a work of satiric verse attacking Thomas Shedwell, one of Dryden's prominent contemporaries, for his offences against literature. Then other works of satire, a genre for which Dryden has received significant praise, that includes Absalom and Achitophel in the year 1681 and The Medal in the year 1682. Then though his early work was reminiscent of the late metaphysical work of Abraham Cowley, Dryden developed a style closer to natural speech which remained the dominant poetic mode for more than a century. Then he is credited with standardizing the heroic couplet in English poetry by applying it as a convention in a range of works including satires, religious pieces, fables, epigrams, prologues, and plays. Then John Dryden died on May 1st, 1700, and was initially buried in St. Anne's Cemetery. Then in 1710, he was moved to the Poets' Corner of Westminster Abbey, where a memorial has been erected. So now let's see the historical context of All for Love. So the English Civil War dominated political, religious, and cultural life in England in the middle of the 17th century. And during the late 1630s and early 1640s, King Charles I experienced increasing tensions with his parliament. And then in 1642, a Republican Puritan faction in parliament took power and banned theatre on the grounds that it was immoral. Then in 1649, after years of fighting between Republican and Royalist forces, King Charles I was executed. And then following 18 years of Republican rule, his son King Charles II returned to the throne in 1660. And then that same year, the theatres reopened. So thus, the restoration of Charles II was also restoration of English drama. And hence John Dryden became a fierce royalist after the restoration, and for the rest of his life he remained wary of the dangers of rebellion, civil war, and threats to hierarchical authority, a political stance reflected in All for Love. Now let's look at the short summary of All for Love. So basically, All for Love begins with John Dryden's dedication of the play to an aristocratic patron, Thomas Osborne. He praises Osborne for his loyalty to the crown during the English Civil War. The praise leads Dryden to a larger consideration of the merits of the English constitutional monarchy, which he calls the best form of government in the world. Dryden thinks that all attempts at reform are dangerous, since any rebellion strikes at the root of power, which is obedience. Dryden then writes a preface about the play itself. The story of Antony and Cleopatra has been oft told, most famously by William Shakespeare, but Dryden has made some changes. So for instance, he has invented new characters and scripted a fictional meeting between Cleopatra and Octavia, that is Antony's Roman wife. He explains that Antony and Cleopatra are appealing protagonists because they are neither wholly good nor evil. So basically, two priests of the temple of Isis, that is Serapion and Myris, observe that there have been several frightening omens in Egypt recently. For instance, the water of the Nile overflowed and left behind monstrous sea creatures. They express their fears for the future of their kingdom, since Antony and Cleopatra have recently and disastrously lost the Battle of Actium to Antony's rival for power in Rome, Octavius. Antony has now locked himself away, hoping to cure himself of his love for Cleopatra. His old general, Ventidius, arrives to try to bring some hope. He tells Antony that he has an army in Lower Syria that is loyal to Antony's cause. However, the army will only fight for Antony if he comes to them. And they do not want to fight for Cleopatra in Egypt. So in order to claim his army, then Antony will have to leave her. So Cleopatra is now in despair when she hears that Antony plans to leave her. So she sends her eunuch, Alexas, who gives Antony a ruby bracelet in the shape of bleeding hearts. Alexas petitions Antony to go to see Cleopatra one last time so that she can fasten the bracelet on his wrist, although Ventidius warns against this. So when Cleopatra appears for her audience with Antony, she swoons and protests pathetically that she only wants to die. And at this, Antony proclaims that will never abandon the woman who loves him, even if it costs him his life. Then several other visitors come to the Egyptian court. Antony's old friend Dolabella, who is in love with Cleopatra, and Antony's wife Octavia. Octavia has also brought their two daughters named Agrippina and Antonia. Octavia tells Antony that she is still loyal to him as a wife despite his abandonment of her. And then Ventidius and Dolabella urge Antony to abandon Cleopatra and take back Octavia. Now Octavia tells her daughters to go to their father, and at their embrace, Antony is so moved that he tells Octavia he will leave Cleopatra. So Cleopatra again despairs at this news. She encounters Octavia in the palace and the two women exchange insults. Octavia accuses Cleopatra of stealing Antony's wife, children, power and political standing, whereas Cleopatra says that she has suffered more because Octavia has the name of wife to protect her whereas Cleopatra has lost her crown and reputation for Antony. Meanwhile, Antony asks Dolabella to break the news of his departure to Cleopatra. When Dolabella arrives, Alexas urges Cleopatra to use Dolabella's feeling for her to make Antony jealous. Now Cleopatra begins flirting with Dolabella. Now ultimately, Cleopatra is unable to go through with it and confesses that she still loves Antony. So Dolabella admires her loyalty and constancy, but it is too late. Now Ventidius and Octavia observes Dolabella kissing Cleopatra's hand and plan to tell Antony, hoping that this will drive a wedge between the lovers for good. Now Ventidius and Octavia bring the news of Cleopatra's infidelity to Antony, and this backfires since Antony becomes frantic with rage and distress. Now coming to the realization that Antony still loves Cleopatra and will never love her, Octavia leaves the palace and returns to Octavia's camp. Now meanwhile, Antony rages at Dolabella and banishes him from Egypt. He banishes Cleopatra as well, who begs his forgiveness and lives proclaiming that she still loves him. Now Antony weeps as they part but orders that they never see each other again. The battle with Octavius continues to go disastrously for the Egyptians. As Antony watches from the roof of the palace, the Egyptian navy surrenders without a fight and joins the Rome forces. Now Antony becomes convinced that Cleopatra has betrayed him to Octavius. Alexas comes up with another plot, recommending that Cleopatra hide in her monument, which she does. Then Alexas tells Antony that Cleopatra was so distressed at his suspicions of her trust that she killed herself. And at this news, all the fight goes out of Antony. He explains that all he wants now is to die, since Cleopatra was the jewel that made his life worth living, and all his conquest, glory and honors were merely the ransom he used to buy her love. Now Antony says, it is the time to give up his power struggle with Octavius and let the world know whom to obey. Now Ventidius accepts Antony's desire to die and expresses his wish to go with him. Since his own life is not worth living without Antony, Antony then asks Ventidius to kill him first, but Ventidius stabs himself instead. Antony then falls on his sword but misses his heart and begins bleeding profusely. Now meanwhile, discovering Alexas' deception, Cleopatra rushes into the room and finds him on the ground. As Antony dies in her arms, he makes a promise to join him soon in the afterlife. Now Cleopatra dresses herself in her royal robes and sits herself on the throne besides Antony. Her maids Eras and Charmian bring her a poisoned asp that fatally stings her. Now Cleopatra proclaims that she will die with Antony as his wife in a bond that no Roman laws will be able to break. And as she dies, she challenges Octavius to ever separate them now. Eras and Charmian follow her example and also commit suicide. Now Serapion bursts into the throne room, leading Alexas in chains. And when he sees the bodies, he remarks on how noble Antony and Cleopatra look and expresses the hope that they will live a happier and free life in heaven than they found on earth. Now let's look at the analysis of All for Love. So basically, in the preface to All for Love, Dryden says that he has imitated Shakespeare's style, but All for Love is regarded as a heroic play. The theme of the drama turns on the conflict between love and honor, between love for Cleopatra and Antony's sense of duty towards his wife Octavia. Antony is described in the images that suggest his superhuman qualities. Antony throws himself down on the ground as a terrific gesture of torment. The structure of the play, like that of the heroics, are curved and the verbal hyperbole is under check. Dryden adopts blank verse and seeks to imitate the elevated style of Shakespeare. In the play, Dryden wanted to adapt Shakespeare's Antony and Cleopatra to neoclassical rules. It has a perfect and complete structure. The play turns on the theme of love and duty. Antony is torn between his love for Cleopatra and duty to his wife Octavia. Octavia is as important as a character as Cleopatra, and it does not represent the all-absorbing passion that is portrayed in Shakespeare's Antony and Cleopatra. The sympathy of the audience is divided between Cleopatra and Octavia. So, in spite of the flawlessness of technique and structure, The play fails to inspire that feeling of awe and pity which we feel in reading Shakespeare's Antony and Cleopatra. And in fact, the play lacks that emotional fire and ardor which Shakespeare's play does possess. Now let's look at the character list in the play All for Love. So the first character that we have is Antony. So basically, Antony, a previously successful Roman general, Antony has essentially gone into retirement following his humiliating defeat at Actium. And as the play begins, his relationship with the beautiful Egyptian queen Cleopatra is unraveling. He is passionately attached to Cleopatra and is unable to extricate himself from their intense relationship. And throughout the play, he is described as possessing large and unsettled feelings, which both make him a brave and great man, but can also undermine him. And towards the end of the play, he attributes any political and military success he has had to his love for Cleopatra. Let's look at the second character, Cleopatra. So Cleopatra is the infamous queen of Egypt who has already enjoyed a romantic relationship with Caesar before taking up with Antony. She is described as sexually irresistible and expresses her love for Antony as passionately as he expresses his love for her. And while she wants to act in ethical and pure ways that reflect her commitment to Antony, she is easily swayed by the strategizing of her eunuch and is not above manipulation. Cleopatra is ultimately just as committed to Antony as she is to her, and when given the opportunity to live in Caesar's court, opts to kill herself instead. Then the third character that we have is Octavia. So Octavia is Caesar's sister and wife to Antony. She travels to Egypt in order to convince Antony to return to his country and his family. She is presented as pure and noble-hearted, and she is committed to doing what is right for her family and country. And in this respect, she is the opposite of Cleopatra and Antony, who respond only to their passions. Then the next character that we have is Dolabella. So Dolabella is one of Antony's dearest old friends. They had a very intimate friendship until Antony suspected Dolabella of being attracted to Cleopatra, his beloved. Dolabella comes to Rome in order to convince Antony to leave Egypt and returns to Rome. Then next we have Ventidius. Ventidius is Antony's old general. He is an older man who has Antony's best interest in mind. He consistently tries to convince Antony to leave Cleopatra behind and return to his life in Rome in order to uphold his political power. And in spite of his desire to help, he misinterprets certain events and does not do a good enough job of preventing Antony from falling back into his codependent relationship with Cleopatra. And at the end of the play, he chooses to kill himself instead of killing Antony. Then next we have Serapion. Serapion is a priest of Isis who portends bad fortune for Rome. Then next we have Alexas. Alexas is Cleopatra's eunuch and the closest thing the play has to an antagonist. Throughout the play, he conspires to keep Cleopatra and Antony together while also protecting himself, which leads to chaos and tragedy. He is also a tragic figure who is depicted as lying only to maintain his precarious position in society. He is ultimately captured by the Roman troops. Now let's look at the themes in All for Love. So first theme that we have is passion. Perhaps passion is the most important theme in the play, and what keeps Cleopatra and Antony in a magnetic pull towards one another the entire time is passion. So both of the lovers feel passionately in both a sexual and romantic sense towards one another. The passion they feel for one another exceeds all reason, and it is what keeps Cleopatra and Antony continually making poor decisions on behalf of their respective countries. Passion throughout the play wins out against reason time and time again, and whenever Antony is on the brink of leaving Egypt once and for all, he is once again called back by his passion for Cleopatra. So likewise, at the end, after Antony has died, Cleopatra determines that she would rather die than live under Caesar. She chooses death over life because of her passionate love of Antony. Then the second theme that we have is the political ramifications of love. So from the start, characters gossip about the political implications that Antony and Cleopatra's affair have had on the world. And in this, we see that their personal affairs are inextricable from the political realms in which they rule. Now, Antony's love for Cleopatra has led him to abandon not only his family, but his country, and has wreaked havoc on his political reputation. Then later in the play, Antony suggests that any success he has had is due to his love for Cleopatra. And when he believes that Cleopatra is dead, he tells Ventidius, he quotes, I was but great for her, my power, my empire, were but my merchandise to buy her love, and conquered kings my factors. He unquotes. And this suggests that any political success Antony had was due to his desire for Cleopatra, and further conflating the personal with the political. Then the next theme that we have is manipulation and persuasion. So many of the characters seek to manipulate or persuade one another in different ways. Ventidius tries to persuade Antony to leave Egypt several times in the play. Dolabella and Octavia also undertake to convince him to leave Cleopatra behind. Meanwhile, Cleopatra and her attendants, particularly Alexas, seek to strategize about how to keep Antony there. Now, time and again, Alexas comes up with plots to keep Cleopatra and Antony together, manipulating information in order to ensure the union. Indeed, Ventidius does this also, persuading Antony that Dolabella and Cleopatra are having an affair when they are not. Then the next theme that we have is power. So the play concerns two influential leaders, Antony, a Roman leader, and Cleopatra, the queen of Egypt. Both of these rulers wield a tremendous amount of power, but when the play opens, their power is faltering as a result of their affair. Now Cleopatra's attendants want her to continue her affair with Antony in order to sustain her power over Rome, while Antony's advisors want him to disengage from Cleopatra as he is neglecting his loyalty to the Roman public. So thus, the force that is in direct conflict with love is power and its preservation. Then the next theme that we have is jealousy. So in a last-ditch effort to win Antony back, Cleopatra takes Alexa's advice and makes an attempt to make him jealous. She judges that jealous love is not as pure as real love, but goes along with the plan to a point. And indeed, jealousy is the major currency and theme in the play, especially in terms of how it pertains to love. Antony is jealous of Cleopatra and Dolabella's connection, even though Dolabella is a trusted and beloved friend. Additionally, Octavia is jealous of the love that Antony gives so freely to Cleopatra but refuses to give to her. Then the next theme that we have is death. So by the end of the play, both Cleopatra and Antony choose death over a life apart. Antony commits suicide under the false belief that Cleopatra is dead. Then seeing that Antony has killed himself, Cleopatra chooses to kill herself rather than face Caesar and his potential mercy. And both of the characters see a world in which the other is dead as an unlivable world and so choose death. And this is at once tragic and romantic, the ultimate sacrifice for one's beloved. Then the next theme that we have is duty. So one of the main ways that Antony's advisors try to convince him to leave Egypt is by invoking the importance of duty. They often tell him that he needs to give up his individual romantic freedom in order to do what is best for Rome, but he is unable to pull himself away. Octavia, his wife, visits him and pleads with him that it is his duty to return to his family. She does not claim to be able to ignite the same passion that Cleopatra does, instead suggesting that it is her duty as a wife to remain loyal to him. So throughout the play, the Rome characters invoke the importance of duty, even when Antony is unable to access his own sense of obligation. Now let's see some of the symbols, allegory and motives in All for Love. So first we have Alexas, the eunuch. This is the symbol. So Cleopatra's eunuch, Alexas, who doubles both as guardian and political operative, is at once a character and a symbol for castration and a more liminal identity generally. In spite of his literal castration, he is very strategic and determined to get what he wants. However, when his manipulative strategies catch up with him, he is left with few options for redemption, and as someone from whom masculine social currency has been taken away, he symbolizes the concept of castration or disempowerment. Then the second symbol that we have is falling on his sword. So at the end, when Antony believes that Cleopatra is dead, he falls on his sword, which symbolizes his own form of castration, getting penetrated and killed by the very instrument with which he might have been a great warrior. It represents the ways that love has turned his outward, militaristic attitudes inward and ultimately undone him. Then the third symbol that we have is the snakes. So likewise, the snakes that Cleopatra uses to kill herself are representative of her own fall from grace. The snakes kill silently and discreetly, poisoning the victim slowly, which represents a more feminized self-destruction rather than a phallic or penetrative demise. Then the next symbol that we have is omens. The omens seen in the Nile that Serapion discusses in the first scene are symbolic of a divine turn for the worse. They represent the fact that something horrible is doomed to happen in Rome. And as we later find out, the omens were correct as Egypt falls to the Romans and Cleopatra dies. Then the next symbol that we have is bracelet. So when Antony says he's leaving Egypt, Cleopatra and Alexis devise a plot to keep him there. Cleopatra sends him a bracelet that he is unable to fasten and which Alexis tells him Cleopatra can help him with. The bracelet thus represents the hold that Cleopatra has on Antony and the fact that she is singularly important to him, the only one who can give him what he wants. Now let's look at some metaphors and similes in All for Love. So first we have purple greatness, it is a metaphor. So early in the play, Antony talks about his career using some metaphors. He says, "Fortune came smiling to my youth and wooed it, and purple greatness met my ripened years." So here he suggests that his youth was wooed by fortune and refers to his success later in life as purple, suggesting that it was marked by nobility. Then next we have like time and death simile. So when Ventidius convinces Antony to join his troops in Syria, Antony becomes excited about returning to the battlefield. He says, "Once more to meet our foes, that thou and I, like time and death, marching before our troops, may taste fate to them, mouth them out a passage, and entering where the foremost squadrons wield, begin the noble harvest of the field." So in this speech, he compares himself and Ventidius to time and death. The next we have a weak and unavailing medicine. Now again this is a metaphor. So when Alexis urges Cleopatra to make Antony jealous, Cleopatra uses a metaphor to explain why jealousy is not an especially helpful thing when it comes to love. She says, "I grant you, jealousy is a proof of love, but it's a weak and unraveling medicine. It puts out the disease and makes it show, but has no power to cure." She calls it a weak and unraveling medicine, something that can help with symptoms but does not provide a cure for love lost. So with this, we have come to the conclusion. So the theme of All for Love is the conflict of reason and honor with passion in the form of illicit love. So from the preface, it seems that Dryden wished to show how Antony, torn between these two, chooses unreasonable, passionate love and is consequently punished for his denial of reason. No great perspicacity required to spot the keyword or to understand how Dryden intends it as the central theme of his play. For though Dryden gives the lovers the best love and passion poetry, he can conceive the long introductory essay to his play, which makes it crystal clear that he takes a strong moral line and thinks they were wrong and immoral, that the neglect of their duties to their families, to their friends, to their armies, and to their countries mean that their wretched fate was entirely deserved and fitting. So in Dryden's view, we are not meant to admire history's most famous lovers, but to condemn them. So though Dryden in the preface to the play writes that he will be revealing the excellency of the moral, yet there is no poetic justice that prevails. The lovers are vindicated because the love is an ennobling passion with a deep commitment to each other. It evokes sympathy in the audience and deep admiration for the nobility and greatness of the passion. Then in the preface, Dryden writes that this legendary love story has been treated by many poets and writers, yet in rewriting it, he desires to take my own pleasure in aiming at the mark. So basically, Dryden's All for Love is the splendid consolidation of his mature poetic. Dryden's style informs and lends aesthetic beauty to his poetics, The color palette of his canvas uses the hues of flickering embers dying to a blackness. Anton is described as cold ashes, an uprooted tree, and at other times to a lion, the son of Hercules, or a meteor. Images which conveys emotional state tone between duty and love. Cleopatra is the priceless jewel he covets. The Nile throws up monstrous creatures doomed to die, which anticipates the faded glory, decay, and ruin that accompanies temporal time. Imagery supports thematic significance. In this play, Dryden uses blank verse instead of the heroic couplet. The Pythonist, terseness, and antithetical style together with the rigid beat of the couplet, dulled cognition and appreciation of the varied and fast-moving passions on the dramatic stage. His well-modulated poetic utterance through the blank verse is intrinsic to the beauty of play. In Essay of Dramatic Poesy, he writes that a play ought to represent human passions, the vicissitudes of fortune, and is meant for the delight and instruction of mankind. In rendering his vision of the exaltation of love, Dryden, the consummate craftsman, delights and instructs his audience and caters to the psychological needs of his age. He is considered the last poet of a golden order. The popularity of theatre is enduring because it is a place which creates a community of people grasping and sharing ever-evolving definitions of humanity and evoking empathy, hope, and love. So friends, I hope you enjoyed this video on All for Love by John Dryden and learned a lot. So you can continue studying with me by subscribing to my channel. Thank you for watching.